ערב טוב, קהל נכבד. אני אתחיל בעברית, אבל אני מיד אעבור לאנגלית. זכות האורח שלנו. ואני רוצה להתחיל להזמין את הדיקן שלנו, פרופסור יהודה קלעי, לברך ולפתוח את האירוע של פתיחת הסמסטר שלנו.
תודה דפי. ברוכים הבאים כולם לפתיחת סמסטר אביב של השנה תשע"ו. בחרנו לפתוח את הסמסטר, אפשר לשבת, יש עוד מקומות. כל אלה שעומדים על יד הקיר. בחרנו לפתוח את הסמסטר בהרצאת אורח, ההרצאה השנתית שלנו, שממומנת על ידי קרן בלנקשטיין. אנחנו שמחים לארח גם את מקס בלנקשטיין, הנציג של המשפחה בארץ. קרן בלנקשטיין נוסדה בשנת 1984, שאני יודע שזה מזמן, לא בתור קרן שמממנת הרצאות, אבל ב-2009 הם החליטו להפוך את הקרן לקרן של הרצאות, שמממנת הבאת אורחים לפקולטה, שאחרת לא היינו יכולים להביא אותם. האורחים עד היום היו ג'ק דיימונד מטורונטו, משה ספדי, ריימונד מוריאמה, תום מיין, אדריאן חז מווסט 8, קייט דיימונד, שאתם בטח מכירים את המגדל הפיקוח שלה בלוס אנג'לס, רוג'ר דינר בשנה שעברה, בשנה פרופסור נאדר טהרני מהקופר יוניון מניו יורק. הרעיון הוא שארכיטקטורה זה מקצוע גלובלי, ואתם נמצאים במקום מסוים, אבל אתם צריכים לשמוע גם מה קורה במקומות אחרים בעולם. והדרך הכי טובה זה כמובן לנסוע לבקר את המקומות האלה, אבל גם אפשר להביא את האדריכלים המובילים בעולם על מנת שיספרו לנו כאן על מה שהם עושים במקומות אחרים. וזה היתרון העצום שהקרן הזאת מביאה לנו, של ההרצאות האלה על שם מורלי בלנקשטיין, שנפטר לפני שנה, אבל השאיר לנו את הירושה הזאת של הרצאות שאנחנו יכולים להביא כל אורח מכובד כל שנה ולראות מה קורה במקומות אחרים. אז אני מאחל לכולם הרצאה פוריה, יש לזה עוד השלכות, מחר אנחנו נארח את האורח גם כן בסמינרים שונים, ואתם תזכו לשמוע מה קורה בניו יורק ובמקומות אחרים. אז ברוכים הבאים וסמסטר פורה לכולם.
תודה רבה יהודה. And now I'll turn into English so that so that you could also understand what I'm telling the crowd. So Nader Tehrani is the principal of NADAAA, or NADAAA, as you told us this morning, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an intensive dialogue with the construction industry. Nader Tehrani is also the new dean of the Irwin Chanin School of Architecture at the Cooper Union in New York, one of the best schools in the world. He was previously a professor of architecture at MIT, where he served at the head of the department from 2010 till 14. As the principal and founder of Office DA, Tehrani's work has been recognized with notable awards, including the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in Architecture, the United States Artist Fellowship in Architecture and Design, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Awards in Architecture. He has also received the Harleston Parker Award in the Northeastern University Multi-Phase Spiritual Center and the Hobson Award for the Georgia Institute of Technology Hinman Research Building. Throughout his career, Tehrani has received 16 Progressive Architecture Awards, as well as numerous AIA, Boston Society of Architects, and ID Awards. In 2013, 2014, and 15, His office has ranked #1 in Design of Architects magazine top 50 firms in the United States. Wow. Tehrani has lectured widely in institutions including the Guggenheim Museum in New York, Harvard University, Princeton University, and Architectural Association, and now you'll be able to write also Technion in Israel. Tehrani has participated in many symposia, including the Monetary Design Conference and the Buell Center, Contemporary Architecture and its Consequences at Columbia University, and the Graduate School of Design beyond Harvard Box. The works of Nader Tehrani has been widely exhibited at MoMA, LA MoCA, and ICA Boston. His work is also part of the permanent collection of the Canadian Center for Architecture and the Nasher Sculpture Center. I suppose that about your work we'll see in your lecture. So as you asked me to shorten it, so I'm skipping the last paragraph, but I'm sure that we'll all see it in your work. Please help me to accept and have our Nader Tehrani to the
Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind introductions and certainly the invitation to Israel. It's a special occasion, and I've never gotten through customs at an airport so fast in my life, so it's really a treat. As you know, I've prepared 2 lectures for this occasion, one tonight and one for tomorrow. The one tonight is called the Tectonic Grain, and it really has to do with our propensity to look at material agency, the nature of materials and the way that they aggregate as a precondition for the advancement of spatial, formal, and other ideas. Now, that does not mean that we're not doing other concurrent researches on program, typology, and so forth, but at the moment of our education, in the heyday of postmodernism, really the 2 debates that were happening at that moment were, on the one hand, the more conservative, if you like, by that moment, reappraisal of history as a repository of form, typology, the city as a mechanism for validation. And on the other hand, there was the emerging reliance on philosophy and literary theory, motoring a kind of critique of the institution of architecture by way of deconstruction. Neither of these 2 were looking at the building industry as a mechanism for challenging pedagogy or practice, for that matter. And that is where we came into the picture. I don't know if the lights can be dimmed or the front lights can be turned off, but I can, oh, sorry. Yeah, that's good. Just, yeah, that's fine. So, when we look at the zebra, of course, we naturalize the idea of the grain. We understand it. It's part of the icon of the zebra. But as we look closely, we realize that, in fact, that certainly is not natural, and that there is a grain to the zebra that happens to go always perpendicular to the extension of torsos, if you like, the torso or the legs in this case. And so once you begin to tailor those stripes in different ways, you begin to understand the artifice of the grain. In architecture, we're constantly doing this. You're oscillating between the natural grain of things. Look at the wood around the room, but also look at the other grains that are implicit in the process of aggregation. The tension between manufactured and natural grains is always at work. The grain of wood, as you well know, is the result of that natural grain, but also the cut, whether you're doing a plane saw, a quarter sawn, a rift saw, etc. And you get different qualities out of that, also different strengths. You're all familiar with veneers, and they produce, through the rotary cut, different conditions. Throughout this lecture, I will use the grain as both a literal and metaphoric entry into this topic. And before we had clients or commissions, we were our own clients. And this coffee table was an opportunity for us to expand the idea of graining through butcher block construction. If you look carefully at the grain of the wood, butcher block is when you get end grain of wood, which is quite solid. It's kind of an industrial process, but through the plywood end graining of wood, you produce a grain. That grain is then reinforced on the perpendicular axis by a quarter sawn walnut, and you see the vertical striations of that, and more importantly, how these grains turn the corners. The top coming in the front, the actual expression of the end grain, and then it turns the corner around the leg with a kind of oblique symmetry. And here I want you to have the image of Palladio's, I don't know, Palazzo Chiriacati or something like that, that the symmetries are designed around the obliques. And then notice that the graining of the walnut on the outside is further reinforced by the zebra wood on the inside. These three grains are speaking to each other and reconciling each other, but notice, of course, that the walnut and the end grain of the butcher block come into friction at that point. It's almost impossible to turn three grains naturally in relationship to each other. And when you cut against that grain, you get the swirl of the leg. By profiling the leg in the classical manner, you begin to reveal something else about that grain. Bramante's Santa Maria della Pace reveals this problem of the grain, because what he does is that he composes the facades of the courtyard orthogonally in section or elevation, as it were, but he forgets to turn the corner. And then the classical orders are swallowed in that critical moment, literally right here, through, what is it, an act of perversion, an act of negligence. It's not clear, but you see the ionic column as it's kind of swallowed by the corner. And this is a brilliant moment, because you realize that the orders are not natural. They are premeditated as a crime, you know? You have to get away with this, you really have to think hard about the displacement of the order in order to possibly duplicate it as a way of turning that corner. Oscillating between the world of natural grain and actual wood grain, we had the opportunity to renovate, as it were, a house in Washington, D.C. Recently, a kind of neo-Georgian brick house that was on the side of a hill, turning a two-story house into four-story, essentially taking the basement and opening it to the garden, and taking the roof and flipping it up into an attic space, doubling the space. This in order not to move out into the suburbs, to remain in the city, to expand the family, 2 more kids, and by doing that, essentially maintain the integrity of the idea of the house. And this was a challenge, of course, because on the one hand, you're dealing with the existing brick, with the existing openings, but then as the new spaces are restructured, the windows are compressing and expanding in search of the rooms that they sponsor, maintaining the symmetry in the front on the north facade, but then not only through an act of the client, but a kind of opening up of the south side to the garden, an idea that those views begin to open up to the solar orientation and the views towards the Washington Mall, the Washington Monument, and really an important view over Rock Creek. And effectively, what appears to be an irrational and erratic grid is really the result of subtle meanderings and symmetrical alignments with new spaces on the inside. And so the very same order that calibrated the north is now migrating to the south, but of course, the displacement of this amount of brick meant that you had to make this into a brick wall, a curtain wall. In other words, this brick is no longer load-bearing. At this point, as the load-bearing wall of the north wraps the building, the steel takes over as a kind of prosthetic device, and the brick is simply suspended as a veneer on top of it. The plan, too, is a transformation of that idea, with load-bearing conditions on the north and a free plan to the south, a kind of classical decomposition from pochette spaces of small spaces as well as open spaces to the south. Now, here is then the most important part of this. If the normative condition of the brick building was to enclose the brick 360 degrees, what we did is we maintained the integrity of the load-bearing walls running north-south to maintain the maximum porosity of the view towards the south. But then implanted in between those brick walls striated plywood that would become the closets, the staircase, the thresholds, and all of the millwork of the house, always maintaining porosity on one axis while solidity on the other. So where you see the solid panels, they are the orientation where you go into the private threshold into the bedrooms, but where you see the combed porosity is when you walk into the building and you sort of open up the view to the south. And maybe most importantly, looking at the two central spaces, by opening up the section upon the entry at the mezzanine level, you open up the view towards the bottom level and the top level all at once. So there's a sectional moment in which this staircase that is torqued at the center of the house becomes the main element that connects the lobby to the homework space of the kids as well as the play area at the top. Then laterally, as I said, the blockages of space that completely close off if you need them to. In other words, it's open when you want it, but large, there's no longer doors. There's walls that slide from one side to the other, completely compressing that space, and this kind of Pyrenean stair that winds from the bottom to the top, making this graining of plywood at multiple scales. In other words, the cross-lamination of plywood is happening at the scale of each ply, but then it's also happening at the scale of each rail, and then also at the scale of each room, and then the scale of the structure of the house. A view looking back north towards the main entry, and the punched opening that opens up towards that main view, with the lateral views, of course, looking through the more figural moments towards the east and the west that take you down. And, effectively walking through the stair is like walking through the guts of the building. It's literally a butcher block construction of plywood. Integration of lighting, electrical systems, security systems, all within that same logic also. The house, while being orthogonal, is operating on the oblique with one of the main public rooms, his office, a home office that kind of wraps the side on the eastern side, and the oblique conditions of the corner becoming a major element that connects the inside and the outside, essentially making the building appear to float. At the level of the office, the columns are meant to dematerialize at those corners, and so too you see a similar approach to the bedrooms that effectively gain that view towards the Washington Monument. And so the scale of the enterprise of graining takes on different meanings as you begin to see that transition from the scale of an end grain of plywood to sliding doors and walls. Now, as we scale to, as we transition to the scale of larger buildings, we also recognize that the same kind of customized control you have over a one-off building like a house is exactly the opposite of a commercial endeavor in Seoul, Korea. A project for a model home sort of commercial center. Essentially, the Samsung model home is essentially a retail space where you're making mock-ups of those apartments inside black boxes above. These are some samples of those types of buildings. They're spectacular buildings. They're excessive. They're grotesque. And they're an imposition on the landscape, but they function something akin to major institutional buildings that we would have, for instance, in the US as museum spaces. The model home gallery then has about 20 apartments that then get built in sets of 40, 60, 80 throughout the skyline. So this is a major endeavor. Instead of going to the building site and seeing one model home, you're going to a center like this, which for which you can sell 20 different models, the high, the medium, the low models, and so forth. Now, in turn, these developers, Hyundai, Samsung, etc., give the base of the building back to the community. So typologically, if you were to abstract this as a concept, there's a big black box above and simply a glass and open box at the bottom. And so part of the game is the game of seduction. How do you get the public in there? It's really the logic of not architecture, but retail is at the center of the game that they're playing. In our case, the site that we inherited was this barren wasteland in the southeast corner of Seoul, what appears to be a tabula rasa. In fact, not at all. With the speed of development that's happening in Asia, between the time that we took this photograph and this site was complete, about 1 year and 3 months later, this entire horizon was filled with buildings. To the right of the site is the park and the subway connection. So in fact, the imperative was, how do you connect to the subway, the park, and extend the park under this site to the corner in the bottom left-hand side of the screen? The speed of construction is extraordinary, so at best, what we could do is control 4 details. That's not what they gave to us. That's a decision that we made. And essentially, the idea of the site was to open up the base, stack pancakes on top of it, and create one vertical atrium that connects to them. So spatially, that's the limit, if you like, of the argument. The drawings were done in less than 6 months. This is a rapid-fire system. I was flying back and forth, doing Skype every day, and we submitted the drawings, I believe, in November of such and such year, and they said we're going to break ground immediately, and then we didn't hear a word from them. And it was one of those classic scenarios where we thought, okay, that's it. They're not going to call us. We've been dropped. And we would keep emailing them, keep calling them. They said, no, this is not the time. This is, you wait. And so effectively, in, I think, middle January or February, we got this image from them. And they said, we're having a problem with your geometry, and so we need your help. So this is the hysterical speed at which they're building there, and through a reconstructed relationship with the engineer, the site supervisor on the site, we re-inaugurated our work on this project. Now imagine we've done very precise modeling on this building, very fine-tuned geometries, and they're just building it just like that. None of the geometries are respected, so now we're going in to do surgery, essentially a renovation on flawed geometries, which means also that those 4 details that we designed, which were premised on the idea of tolerance, not exactitude, would come to serve us. So the tectonic systems that we're after essentially were really fundamental things. Understanding that the base was glass and that we needed structure, we opted for a vertical graining that would be a storefront system that would wrap the entire building, but with the aptitude of expanding and contracting. And then knowing fully well that the building in the round on top would never be built correctly because it was a compound curvature, we realized if we break it up into horizontal louver systems, the shadow of the louvers would conceal the imperfections of its construction system. And the windows would get kind of embedded, embossed within the logic of those louvers. The urbanistic idea behind it was very simple. The idea that the park goes through the building, and then the building suspends the structure rather than the building being supported from below. So above, you have columns, you have staircases, you have skylights, you have elevators. All of the services, the lights, the mechanical systems are embedded and encrypted in the ceiling and kind of hang like stalagmites. And it's an abstract system. It's not a beautiful crafted system like the plywood I showed in Rock Creek. What you see in this representation is really no different than the built artifact because it is just paint. That's all it is. The floor then is an extension of the park. The very granite that populates the walkways of the park extend into the building and then back out as a kind of seamless condition. The building lands on top of it, but just delicately and touching only in one place so that the galleries can be open and flexible with essentially all of the systems that are then embedded in these slots that intervene on them with one typological insertion. And that is the idea that knowing that the garage needed to slope down from the north side into the basement, we had the opportunity of essentially nesting the auditorium directly on top of it like this, but more importantly, opening up the proscenium so that the auditorium not only looks through the gallery and towards the landscape, but you have a kind of symmetrical theater whereby the stage is open from both sides to look into those collective activities that happen on the center. The plan then is effectively or conceptually a hypostyle hall, except that the columns of those plans are getting thicker according to the dimension of the program. The auditorium, the VIP room, the flexible meeting rooms, some of the services, and of course some of the columns. The idea is that diagonally you can just walk through the building, maintain the clarity of glass that goes from one side to the other, with the kind of ephemeralness of the light below and the blockiness of the spaces above, which are simply black box commercial spaces. Here then the two tectonic systems that come into confrontation with each other. Essentially the vertical graining of the storefront here is really the result of 3 different grains. On the south, with a lot of sun, the graining of the structure is supported also by a tighter mullion spacing as well as fritting on the glass. On the east and the west, we get deep fins because the vertical fins protect from the sun, and we flush out those very conditions on the north. But that system has the granularity to be able to be interpreted in different ways as you navigate around the building from different orientations. The structure is absolutely generic domino frame with a simple carving of those corners and a kind of rotational curvature that goes around the sides, if only to suggest that the building on top has no front or back. It is an icon in the round, speaking effectively to the skyline of Seoul on either side. Keep in mind that the skyline of Seoul produces this interesting tension between nature and architecture, with all of the office and apartment buildings being these extruded fabrics of 20, 30-story buildings that read against the curvature of our building, and then the skyline beyond that is the mountainscape, which reads against the base of our building. These two become a device by which our building is not a mirror of that landscape, but merely an index of it. As I said, the louvered system here is not protecting you against the sun, it's protecting against the inevitability of a flawed construction system. And then we go back to the question of graining, how not I-beams, but T-beams, T-mullions, fritting become a kind of vertical grain. They get readjusted in relationship to densities that are required. A glass base, the roof sits on top of that. The black box, as it rests on top of that, as it's negotiated with key heights and water drainage, begins to distort that roof. And of course, those penetrations that you need for fenestration above give you a wink as they open from one side to the other. This, by the way, I present to you as a bad project. It's important to recognize that while you're doing projects, the question of control, the question of patronage, and the question of quality have a distinct relationship to each other, and speed is a factor in that. To what degree can you actually do a good piece of architecture in such an environment? And my argument would be, if there's anything smart about the building or strategic about the building, it was once we realize what the game is, the game of speed, the game of tolerance, and what the mission of the client was, you make the most strategic choices under those circumstances. They don't guarantee an outstanding building, but they guarantee a surgical response to those issues. The question of graining then becomes alive again in the context of the New Hampshire house. And in this case, we had another one of these extraordinary opportunities to build a house on top of a hill that faces the presidential range in New Hampshire. A kind of rotunda, a circular-oriented house, each of the rooms of which point to target a different mountaintop, Mount Washington, Mount Lincoln, Lafayette, etc. The idea that these mountains are a central part of it made the possibility for us to take on the problem of prefabrication and customization at the same time. In other words, knowing that this is a place afar, we could build everything in a controlled environment and transport each room one at a time while giving a global geometry to the overall form of the house from the top. Thinking of typologies that both look out as well as look in. This played a major role of it, because our inside space would be a place of not only surveillance but rather respite, a kind of control from the harsh conditions of New Hampshire on the outside, but also the idea that each of these rooms are looking out at these extraordinary spaces, and then working both laterally and longitudinally. Think of the dog trot house as a typology and the way that one can cut through it, penetrate it as a framed opening, but then also think of the long colonnade of a stoa in its ability to torque and connect the entire building together. And this building really is a combination of those two things, as well as a certain detail. The notion that the vertical cladding of classical New England construction, board and batten, tongue and groove, and vertical louvers all become the instrument by which this architecture comes aligned comes alive from the moment of the detail. This is a different house, but trying to put you in that material moment that informs the sensibility of the house from the scale of the detail on the one hand to the morphology of the house at another scale. So I don't know if yes, you can just see in light gray the squares of each of the rooms as they look out at the landscape, a global geometry that holds it together by the ring of the roof, and then how each of these spaces get populated inside and outside, interstitial spaces and main spaces that are the result of them. A basic room, in this case the bedroom, looks out onto Mount Washington, nothing there. I mean, it's very straightforward. And then the penetration of that very same system, connecting the outdoors to the indoors here on a fall day that you can open it all, but that also closes up to become a sealed system holding the environment within. The driveway, the main house, as well as a guest's suite out towards the left, and the section bringing the cars into a donut in the center of the building, essentially mirroring the courtyard as a kind of central space that occupies the center of the building. And then the building really is a negotiation between, as I said, the lateral grain of the plan as well as the longitudinal that's wrapped around, in this case, adopting the techniques of the French hôtel particulier, which would absorb the service spaces within the context of thickened walls. Here then that tension between the thick space of the center and the light space of the edge is revealed at the entry condition, where the canopy is unfolded and unruled in the entry space as you come in. You can see now the graining of the wood, the tongue and groove system, broken down into smaller pieces as it navigates the ruled surface, which indexes essentially the trajectory of the staircase that goes from the house to the roof as it ascends. And thus the archway that takes you into the house is really an impression of the very stair that gets you up there at the end of this promenade. That very moment is also the entry, the drop-off of the driveway. You have access, a visual access to the courtyard, but you're not inside of it, but you go in there to the main entry, and essentially it becomes a grotto from which you access the center of the house, with a kind of space of respite within the center of the building. And then the courtyard in the center then is this moment where effectively all of the exterior is barred from you. The cladding of the inside, the vertical cladding, has many different iterations here, as vertical louvers, as large fins, as board and batten, as tongue and groove, and finally the vaultway, all of which is in service of one dominant opening, which is essentially the main framed view of Mount Lincoln towards the south east. The graining of the plan then, beyond the tectonic unit, is an old game, and you've seen that old game played through by Lucan, you've seen it played by Sterling, but effectively in this case it's played out on a more miniature scale, weighing on the one side the convention of type as a generic off-the-shelf space with the notion of customization, using the junction of the two in tension with each other to reconcile the geometric differences of the two. From a very different sensibility point of view, this is also drawing from the architecture of Sharon and remind me on the left side, I forget his name, the bullpen, fantastic architect, but the notion of grafting geometries together in order to reconcile the individuated differences of each room. Here then, the perpendicular grain as you look into the courtyard on the left, but also the longitudinal grain as you wrap around the house in the public corridor that becomes the mainstay of this house. Again, going back to the different scales of the building, the scale of the room, the scale of the fin, the scale of the window, the scale of the door, the scale of the board and batten, the tongue and groove, and finally the louver, that these expressions find their way into the minuscule dimension of the house based on the proximity that you have to it. And of course, the floor plates are indifferent to that grain because they, in a way, they act as a kind of sandwich for the system, if only to reinforce the notion of other sandwiches to come during the winter time. We are interested in the idea of graining not so much in an innocent way. In other words, we understand also that there is a relationship between the figuration of the building and the contents it holds. So the work we're doing is constantly a kind of struggle between the expression of the building on the outside, its constructive systems, but also what they contain from within. Consider, if you will, the graining of corrugation. What is beautiful about corrugation is how on the vertical axis it's structural. It's almost like a beam, but on the horizontal axis it's malleable. And in so being, you can insert a stair, you can see the stair there, and the skin becomes a spatial element, a tectonic element that's spatial. It's superficial, if you like, that connects the living room to the garden as an extension of the skin. But also, most importantly, here's a moment where we describe the idea that a ruled surface is not an illustration. Drawing here is not an illustration, illustrative act. Drawing is always already part of the act of construction. The fact that we can prove that the line at the top of the corrugation is the same length as the undulating line at the bottom makes this a conical surface, a ruled surface, and therefore developable. Thus, as a sheet material, you can build this. You don't need to do a mock-up of this. The drawing is already proof that this is a possible construction. And the grain of corrugation is a kind of, is the scent of that tectonic grain. Recognizing also that we're operating in a way that architecture, whether we like it or not, is part of a system of signification and legibility. It's also always on a very delicate line if it's reducible to one meaning. And so we're constantly working with the tectonic grain to expand the possibilities of what an architecture can do. Here in Casa La Roca in Venezuela, we were confronted with the building of a house that was unfortunately right next to the in-laws. And you know how in-laws can break the marriage almost immediately. So in this case, there was not enough property to maintain the privacy of the house. So the house was in plan an L configuration with this one wall that would give a sense of porosity while being closed. We were infatuated with the Scandinavian work of Leverance and how the mortar is a variable dimension in Leverance's work. So we asked ourselves, what would it mean if we develop a variable bonding pattern for the brick wall such that it could expand and contract through a diagonal crease that we insert into it. And by doing that, it not only gains lateral stability, but it also invites the passage of light and air into the space beyond it. Here is not only the semiotics of operability, openness, and the invitation to the in-laws, but it's also a kind of environmental response to that situation. Here, much like the corrugation of the previous project, these are ruled surfaces, except they're corbelled brick. One brick at a time, they cantilever out 1/4 of an inch, producing the depth of that geometry, which is akin to Jefferson's serpentine walls in Virginia or Eladio Dieste's Atlantida Church. This is a wall that expands on those technologies, except now it's light, diaphanous, and open. In this same musing, we were absolutely fascinated by Ito's Tods in Tokyo, and the grain of the wood, the structural grain of the wood in the background as it speaks to the trees in the front. Again, this is the image I saw in the magazines. Quickly buying my ticket over there to see it, I was a little bit let down by the indifference of the interior. Essentially a classical modernist plan with flat slabs, hardly any sectional connections, but absolutely no indication of those structural conditions from the inside to the outside. In other words, however we read this building, it's locked into a paradigm that you and I know so very well between the dock and the decorated shed, but the performativity of that structure was nothing to be seen. And this is where we come in. We were shortlisted for a site at the AUB in Lebanon, for this site right here, against one of 4 other young architects, as well as one giant architect who was an alumna. And calculating the politics of the outcome, we realized that we're not going to win no matter what happens. And this is a good excuse to do exactly what you want to do. And what I wanted to do was to complete Toyo Ito's project. And that's more indicative of the way that we work anyway. We all work this way. We're always select an audience. We're in dialogue with somebody, or we're completing somebody's sentence, or we're contradicting somebody. But I wanted to do a building that did not speak to the history of buildings on the site, nor the morphologies of those buildings, but in a bosque of trees to speak to those trees. But how do you do that? I said to myself, let's develop a geometry, in this case the hexagon, that once tweaked can become a triangle, and therefore a morphologically flexible column that could expand to become a pilotis, or it could rotate to transfer structure if necessary, or flatten out to become a wall. So in one geometric grain, we're able to satisfy all of those elemental transformations from wall to column through the truncation of a geometry. Now, if we extend this logic, we can also spatialize it. Imagine that you need a system that's thick and pochade and spatial at the bottom. It needs to transfer its structures in the middle where rooms don't align, and naturally to optimize the structure, we can thin it out at the top, which makes that branch-like condition of Ito palpable. Putting this all together in the context of a regular building that has to provide for a program, we realize that it's basically a domino frame that becomes distorted against the very programs it has to sponsor. Here, the transfer beam of a public hall. Here, the backspan of a cantilever. Here, the distortion of the structure in relationship to an auditorium, just like this space. Or at the top, the lightening of the structure. Imagine then a structural system that speaks to the spatial, programmatic, and promenade conditions of that very building, giving body to the spaces that it requires, but also in terms of the system that is deployed around it. Here, program, skin, structure all come together in a grain that is responsive to a particular phenomena that operates between the idea of figuration on the one hand and configuration on the other. Imagine this bowl and imagine this nest. They are at the end the same thing. They're two semi-spherical artifacts like this. The bowl is cast concrete, but because of the way it's polished, it erases the grain of the aggregate that is an imminent part of that bowl. The nest articulates the grain of the grass that is its tectonic unit, and therefore is the result and the expression of a configurative process. Its organization is manifest in its final identity. Our arguments more often than not reside on the right-hand side, where the grain of construction is always at display within the figures that we're operating on, but we're always in the back of our head have a clear idea of the classical figures with which we have to work and on which we have to operate. Another folly in Korea, a fantastic one, which completely undermined us, on the old walls of Gwangju, where the historic fortification was, we were asked to do a new gateway as part of the Biennale, a kind of permanent installation, not something for the exhibit only. And we were fascinated by the work of Snelson and the tensegrity structures that he did. And why? Because the tensegrity plays an optical trick on you. You have all of these compressive struts in the air, but your eye does not see the tensile members. And so the entire structure looks like it's floating in midair. The problem with that, of course, is that you have to customize every geometric point, and you can't calculate the structure as a rigid thing. You're tightening the structure as you go along. But we developed this with an engineer, and we did the working drawings of it, and we got to the deadline 1 week before the final deadline. And the client said they loved it. They were absolutely fascinated by it. And they said, but would you mind if we just get rid of the tensile elements altogether? And we build it only out of compressive elements. So, yes, it was funny, but not so funny, because that means that in 1 week we had to go back and reconceptualize this. It undermined the very presence of this thing. So we did something that's against the very ethic, against the very ethic I've been arguing for this entire lecture. We realized, okay, how do we optimize this? Here's the corner of the site. Here's the maximum oval or ellipse we can occupy on. There are two trees. Void them out. There's a center between these two trees. Let's void that into an oculus so we use less material. And in effect produce a cloud that touches the ground in the least amount of spaces, because that's where the underground infrastructure is not, because there's sewer system there, there's water there, there's electricity there. How do we develop a system which gives lateral stability to this, but in a way is stealth in its incorporation? Most importantly, we had to produce a working drawing which was, again, rooted in minimum communication, maximum tolerance. We developed a formwork in the shape of an elliptical cloud that you could build with light wood gauge, and then the steel, that is the image of chaos that you see there, would be the result of structural forces that are compressive on one axis, light on top, and gain lateral stability at the capital. Every rod, the rule was, would have to be welded in at least 3 locations, and each time that they put something up, they shake it to make sure that it's just rigid enough to stand. And so this was a real home-cooked construction process. We developed structural parameters. We developed a recipe of how to operate on it and the overall geometry, but everything that happens within it is absolutely random, completely disengaged from any other directive, as long as it becomes this ephemeral figure in relationship to the retail that it supports. this is for tomorrow. This is just a kind of appetizer of what I'm showing you tomorrow, but it's well worth a kind of a comment right now that during 2007-8, right before the economic crash, we were lucky enough to be shortlisted for 3 competitions: a School of Architecture at Georgia Tech, a School of Architecture in University of Melbourne, and a School of Architecture at University of Toronto. The entire world was going downhill, and we won all 3 of these. And this is really what bridged us to where we are today and is making us survive in some way or another. But what is interesting about these projects is that your audience is a body of architects, faculty and students who, if not are more sophisticated than you are in the very realm that we're studying, but are an audience that are absolutely literate and participant to what you do. And yet these are 3 different schools of thought, 3 different urbanisms, 3 completely different modalities of learning. But this is where the moment of the project of building and the project of learning come together in pedagogical buildings. They're not only spaces of learning, they're moments where the building of architecture is part of has a didactic function. So I stop there and go back to the beginnings of our own pedagogy when we didn't have buildings to do. This is what we did. We built installations. And these experiments in steel, in rope, in polycarbonate, in plywood, in wood, in all sorts of conditions, became instruments of risk-taking that could then translate to a larger scale. And this is as part of an extension of what we started at the Rhode Island School of Design some 20 years ago, became part of the base pedagogy that we took to the GSD at Harvard, and then became the foundations of the laboratory for the Fab Lab that I did at MIT. In a strange way, it's full circle, because 25 years ago, when nobody was building, Cooper Union was the only place that was using building as a speculative platform, which is where I am now. I was always fascinated with contradictory structures. Here, you're very familiar with CISA's Expo structure, the lightness of that tarp that is suspended between this large civic archway to the water, in fact made out of concrete. Equally fascinating, the never-built project by Lou Kahn, where the bow truss becomes an inhabitable space which is occupied by the auditorium that is its index. You're also well familiar with the catenary experiments of Gaudí that optimize structural conditions turned upside down. What we had to deal with in this exploration for a one-off installation at the Boston Society of Architects was to develop a compressive catenary. I know that sounds contradictory, but that's precisely the point. How do we develop not a vault this way, but a vault this way, but one on which you can stand? There are many ways in which we'd explored catenaries before that with paper clips, but here was an opportunity to develop from the idea of the catenary an understanding of its forces as a line, if that were paper clips, but then how to thicken that as a massive composite system. Think of the floor slab as a light composite construction system on which you can stand, for instance, but you would have to recognize that you're screwing with the integrity of the catenary at that point, because you're thickening it and it's becoming less optimal all of a sudden. So you'd have to take the center line of that, but also break it. If it's a compressive system, it's like the keystoning of a vault, but inverted, and something would need to happen on that to lock it into place, otherwise it would just fall out. And so that was the nature of the problem that we had to work in order to make something akin to the flat arch of the Escorial. Note that the flat arch of the Escorial is absolutely flat, though a representation of the dome, because the keystoning moment of the Escorial is not at the center. It continues all the way to the edges before it comes down. And that is something you can only witness in section. Our keystoning was a kind of puzzle interlock piece where the keystone goes and locks into another piece as a mechanism for the support of the next piece. We realized through a composite foam system that we could support over 250 pounds, the entire weight of the overall element, into a three-pronged arch that would become the structure that is mass customizable, CNC routed, and developed for the main entry space that would be on top of the entry at the BSA. As you ascend, you begin to see the patterning of this piece above from the staircase, with its end pieces as they support from one side to the other. And then instead of essentially the keystone at the center, you have a tensile void in the center, because that's the only moment where there is no materiality. The interlocking pieces have some tolerance to move, absolutely smooth from the bottom. A kind of rustication begins to emerge at the top. Here, of course, it has to do with the logic of routing. If you're routing this thing, it can be double curved on one side, but you need a flat bed on the other side in order to put it on the bed. So you can chisel the edges of that to reconcile the fact that you can't smooth it out, so it becomes massive, block-like, almost different steps on which you can walk, but the opposite of what the smooth side on the opposing side is. And then working really with a kind of tectonic imaginary of the classical that goes from the rustication of the base to the smooth conditions at the top. Going full circle now back to the furniture that I presented in the beginning, this notion of aggregation is deeply rooted in the idea of big blocks. Here, a drawer system of a massive dresser here, where you have all of the kind of earrings at the top, the underwear in the center, and the sweaters at the bottom, designed and built as a compressive system that magically floats. The legs are offset into the center of it, floating delicately on three razor blade seams embedded in the grain of the piece. And then when the drawers open, you have no idea what they're supported on. Essentially, the grain of the structure is encrypted within the logic of this masonry system. The suspension moment and the interlocking systems. This idea of working with aggregation and masonry units then gets completely undermined when you're working with concrete, because concrete is a liquid medium. And so all of a sudden we run out of techniques and we have to think in a completely different way. But for the Ramatuelle house, we first started with the idea of typology. And type 2, even in its abstraction, has a grain to it. The biaxial symmetry of the Jerba house or the country house on the right reflects some of the most salient Renaissance villas that we know of. And yet, in our case, it produces a synergy in section that is the result of a sloped site. We take an archetypical courtyard typology and we shift it in section such that it is a mirror of the landscape, where the top wing overlooks the bottom one and produces the kind of orientation that you want. The swimming pool is the keystone of this project. As the top floor looks over it, the bottom floor looks into the swimming pool. And then the top floor is naturally the living rooms, the public areas, the master suite, while the bottom floors are multiple bedrooms that are like dormitory style that can fit up to between 7 and 22 people, depending on how you work it through. But more importantly, the bathrooms, if you look carefully, are then ganged up dormitory style up across here so that they are on the edge of the swimming pool and the kids go in and out there. The main entry, a kind of concrete wall that I'll explain in a second, that you punch through to get through the main living room with a kind of opening towards the Mediterranean. This is the other side of the Mediterranean, of course. And a classical modern space is actually quite different, because as you see the extrusion of that space, you realize despite the view towards the Mediterranean, there's another view uphill that produces a vaulting system that spans longitudinally, not laterally, as we look up into the Pinus Pinei on the opposite side. The sliver of vaults produce these large concrete vaults that displays the massive potential of what concrete can do. And this is at the large structural and figural level. But it also gives the possibility of opening cracks of views outside of the figural large view towards the Mediterranean in relationship to trees that are so much part of the heritage of the site. Looking at the building then, it's the result of the distortion of the site, the optimal planimetric orientation of the building. The courtyard building slipped, as I said, sectionally to reflect the topography of the site, the roof of which undulates in relationship to the operability of the trees on the other side. And most importantly, these big armatures of the courtyard type intersecting each other to lock into each other structurally at this most important moment, which is really the vault of the landscape as it goes from the lower landscape up into the swimming area, living room, and out onto the north. What's important about this image is not the gateway into the project, but the notion that this east wall that cantilevers out is not a facade. This is a beam, and the entire depth of that facade is a concrete beam that is supported by a stair on one end and the swimming pool wall that intersects the master suite. And so the combination of these encrypted structures are part of the morphological grain of this plan and section, and very much what make it alive and work as a piece of landscape. This is not a house, it's a piece of landscape that is overtaking the classical type. The structure then is really the extension of the bottom edge of the swimming pool as it comes up and intercepts the facade on the opposite side, encrypted, if you will, and the kind of transition of the landscape also has a materiality as the terracotta of the outside goes into the bedrooms, into the corridors, using the tile of the bathrooms to slip outside of those zones and effectively become an instrumental part of the engagement with the swimming pool. In the bathroom and the shower spaces, you're actually looking back into the swimming pool. Now, to end then this argument about graining, really it goes back to what constitutes grain when you don't have a natural found condition in that material. Liquid as it is, the expression of concrete is either in the formwork, a precondition that you can artificially put there. With an aluminum formwork, it looks reflective. With slatted wood, you see the imprint of the wood grain, or post-operational work, bush hammering it to get the kind of effect that Paul Rudolph used to get. But effectively, there are two modalities in which we thought of this possibility for this house. And thinking of fabric-formed work and the kind of premeditated tension that one can create between a formwork that is animate and able to speak to the productivity of that liquid form. In the first modality, we thought of this as a representational space. In other words, through CNC routing, we could create from that smooth surface a rustication that produces the depth and the weight of the entry space as an extension of the stone wall landscapes that you see everywhere. But the other way to interpret this is through a tectonic grain where the aggregates of the actual concrete come to life. Now, on the interior of the building, those would be very smooth. But as you go into the landscape, we pour each pour in separate phases, adding aggregates that slightly gain in the scale of the grain of the stone each time, such that by the end of it, it effectively is the stone wall itself. It is no longer a representation of that stone wall. It is the stone wall. Now, those of you who've been through southern France understand the kind of archetypical nature of those stone walls that characterize the landscape at large. But these are two ways of thinking about architecture that are very much part of our current predicament and moment. When I first went to Rome, I had no idea what this grain represented. What was it? I didn't understand that somebody was on their knees laying out stone, and the vaulting of this was really an index of the body. And when they couldn't reach anymore, they got up, they moved forward 3 feet, and they started again, which essentially maps out the arced fanning of the Roman street. And this tradition has lasted over 2,000 years, even with the kind of graffiti work that we see all around the world. The expression of that, though it may seem different, is really the result of the human reach. But we're entering into a slightly different phase right now, and we're all living it through, where all of the discussions that I've been, in a way, putting on the plate for you are on the verge of obsolescence with the idea of 3D printing. Now, I understand that 3D printing is operating at the scale of the bottle, at the scale of a unit, but what will really happen when 3D printing overtakes the necessity of the seam in a joint or the performance of a skin, where all of the insulation, water barrier, and sheathing of the building are embedded within one printout? That will become a different world. But the questions that occupy our mind in terms of the problem of the grain will become a different one. In the context of the Ramatuelle house, as I said, this is a landscape project, and so very much part of the thinking of how architecture and landscape are embedded in each other's grain. And so with that, I bring this talk to a close and invite questions if you have any. Thank you very much.